that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me to present on behalf of the Commission today. Can I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the wider Noongar Nation, and pay respect to their elders past and present. Good morning. Good morning. I'm going to do three things in the next 25 minutes. I won't be speaking for all of it, but I'm going to take about 15 minutes or so to do three things. First of all, I'm going to show you from a structural perspective what the Conservation and Parks Commission is. Secondly, we're going to delve into policy and principle and look at the whole concept of management plans and some of the philosophies around biodiversity that we try to reflect in devising management plans. And thirdly, this is getting narrow as we go down through the funnel, give you some examples of values in a recent management plan that will be close to your heart. We'll deal with the four in the plan, and as a codicil to that, look at some of the issues around doing planning surveys within the public conservation estate. Now, I won't get into too much technicality. I just want to give you an impression of who we are, what we do, and also the governance and sort of political legal regime around conservation land management within this jurisdiction, within Western Australia. It will be parallel in other jurisdictions, but there are, as there are similarities, there are also differences. So what's the Commission? The Commission is an independent statutory body that advises the government on the management and extension of the conservation estate within Western Australia. What is the conservation estate? It is lands and waters, public lands and waters that can be classified for protection against certain hierarchies of levels of protection, and which can then be, by formal processes of law, brought into a scheme of management and regulation. The Commission is made up of people from various walks of life, and I put this rose gallery up because these are my other colleagues on the Commission. My professional affection and esteem goes to these colleagues, but I'm not showing the pictures for the sake of it. What I'm showing you there is the range of backgrounds and interests that are represented. And don't forget, there have been various iterations of this Commission and its predecessors, so people change. These are statutory appointments, these are conferred after cabinet consideration by the government of the day for periods of 2, 3, 5 or more years. But you can see there, and those of you at the back might be able to see the range, we've got a number of people who have come from various backgrounds. The chair from Governance, Planning and Heritage, she was former president or chair of the State Heritage Commission. We have a representative from an Aboriginal community, Ingrid Cumming, who is a Whadjuk Noongar woman. Very careful there, one Aboriginal community. Many voices speak for Indigenous communities, and we must always remember that. But we have one person there. We have a professor who deals with ecotourism and tourism, a legal expert in native title and Aboriginal heritage matters, works with one of the native title representative bodies, a coastal and estuarine ecologist from Murdoch University, and an experienced person, Mr. Walker there, in forest management and national resource management. The point being that these people have different perspectives and can give their advice to the government of the day on various issues affecting the conservation estate. We're only a small group, and so we have a service agreement with the Department of Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions because we need their technical and administrative firepower to support the work that we do. So what do we do? So we'll just go down and get to this. Well, I can't get to my notes, so you'll have my undivided attention looking at you. That'll be good. We do a number of things. One of our jobs is to provide advice to government on the biodiversity of the state, and that is biodiversity that may be encompassed within the reserve conservation estate. That may be other broader issues relating to biodiversity. We have a specific duty to propose and review the management plans for the parks and reserves that are within the conservation estate. And let me just deal very briefly with that. This state, like other jurisdictions, has for some years now followed the broad principles of comprehensive, adequate and representative inclusion of natural features within the reserve system. My own provenance in all this was on the Marine Parks side, from the former Marine Parks and Reserves Authority, which was folded into the Joint Commission 2 years ago. And by way of practical example, looking in the Kimberley, we would have a stretch of coastal water out to the state jurisdictional limits, and we would try to choose within that area features of the natural environment that fulfilled these criteria. Comprehensive, all types of phenomena are included. Adequate, there's enough of it in there. And representative, does it represent the flora and fauna? And increasingly these days the discussion moves to more abstract concepts such as landscape, not just species, but landscape. Does that fit within a car reserve concept? Why do we do this? Well, and this is very important for you to understand, because I think your work feeds into potentially what we can do, and also what we can do here can affect the impact of the public and interest groups in particular in what they do in the conservation state. What we're recognising in the reserve system is that parks and reserves are public assets. They are public assets. And the constant tension we have is balancing the desire for conservation with use. With use. In the marine estate, fishing is one of the most obvious examples, commercial and recreational. In the intertidal zone, four-wheel drive vehicles. On the terrestrial zone, vehicles, unregulated walking, unregulated collection of specimens, rocks, whatever. So what happens when you have a management plan is that these plans are eventually given a legal status. They're given a legal status. And the department on our behalf can begin to step in and regulate activity. Can begin to regulate activity. So you can, in say a marine plan, have zones that say certain things cannot be done. And the one that always hits the news is around recreational anglers and sanctuary zones. That's an obvious one. But other uses, are there speed limits on powerboats? Can you windsurf? It's a very diverse world out there, as you know, and the interest that we may have in conservation of species, in conservation of landscape, are tempered by the many aspirations of other individuals and groups who want to do lots of things which may not necessarily be compatible with the objectives we collectively wish to achieve. So, in putting these plans together, it is a matter for the Commission, as aided by the Department, to synthesise and present to Government the community, scientific and technical input that we can gather. And in the end, there are some, as they say, difficult calls to make, because there may be a range of competing interests, particularly within a regional community, where the ultimate decision on what will be protected and to what level of protection will be, in plain terms, a political one. We need to understand that. So, from the Commission's point of view, we fight the good fight on many of these things, but we have to be quite pragmatic about what we can achieve. I'll give you another example in the marine domain. Many environmental groups put up a very high percentage of target for sanctuary zones. And we and governments are roundly criticised when plans are published that don't meet or come near their high percentage of what they would like protected by sanctuary zone. Well, let me put the choice to you. Do we not step in and put a regime of protection around, even say at a notional 8, 10, 12% of sanctuary zone? Or do we put in that level of protection with other controls about access and use? Lay the foundation down in an area for a plan, and then over time, as we have found, with increased public access and amenity, the process of public support for further, I hate the word, regulation or restriction makes itself present, and over time we can begin to enhance levels of protection. So with these management plans we can establish the parameters for the management of the public resource. We can declare what values are and that need to be protected, and we can, through the department, begin to limit and shape the nature of activities that go on within the conservation estate. But also we are, on behalf of the community of Western Australia, expending public money. And every now and again, the whole process is subject to audit. For example, the Marine Park System was audited 3 or 4 years ago by the Office of the Auditor General. Is there efficient and effective use of public funds and public effort in managing this? So how do we know whether there is efficient and effective use, both from an internal performance assessment or audit perspective and when we are independently audited? Well, by having management plans with stated values, things that need to be protected, that are reported on each year as part of normal departmental reporting cycles, we, with the department, can advise the Minister from time to time on whether we are succeeding in or not, or whether we're in a holding pattern, in some cases, in protecting the values that have been identified in a particular plan. Let's just look at biodiversity values in management plans. Now, the Conservation and Land Management Act identifies fundamental biodiversity values, and we put those into the management plans. And I just break these down for purposes of exposition into a couple of types of values. And we've got the ones on the left there, the values of biodiversity, which are important to people. I won't go into these in detail, but you can see the effect of the natural environment, pollination and seed dispersal, cultural values to the wider community, but in particular these days recognised for Indigenous communities, and psychic or health values, the human health values associated with having amenity. And then, and I'm talking to people who have loads of scientific training and experience, you would recognise the values on the right there, in the right bubble, the values of biodiversity, not of direct benefit to people. The interaction of species, with habitat. So what we try to do when we create these management plans is understand the values, and it isn't a perfect process, but we have a department that has considerable experience, supported by work in the universities and in the community and in commercial spheres. And it's a matter of amassing information and then trying to make some sense of it. Here's an example of key values related to flora in relation to one recently issued management plan. Management plan number 90, issued in 2017, concerning the Albany Coast Parks and Reserves. Just run your eye down that list. These were the items that were placed within the plan as key values that needed to be protected. The job of periodic review, the job of day-to-day management is to keep an eye on these areas and to manage them and to alert the department and ultimately ourselves if we are beginning to slip below standard in the management of those values. But you can see we go from, there's a range of values there. There's broader habitat, there's specific species. And then going back to a comment I made earlier, the concept of landscape as you get down there towards the bottom. Coastal landscape. By way of example, we looked at an application for some extension of mining work, comment on an application that was before the EPA a few months ago, where a dormant lease was going to be reopened. And one of our, this one didn't go ahead by the way, one of our overwhelming comments was that by taking the top off a small range, the proponents would irrevocably alter the cultural and visual picture that we as a community, and in particular the traditional owners, would have of that landscape. And this is a picture that sits well above individual species. And then the last point there was a very, very important one, which I'll come back to in a moment. There were, in this area alone, 11 registered Noongar heritage sites of archaeological, mythological, ceremonial, cultural and spiritual significance. So those are built into this plan. We aspire to protect those. Our periodic review systems examine how we are going with the protection, and the regional officers of the department, the officers on their rounds, as part of their information gathering and watch, keep an eye on what is going on and report periodically on any adverse developments. Let me come to your domain, planning surveys. And naturally we get many, many requests to investigate flora and vegetation values in unvested lands. All the lands and the waters that are in the reserve system are vested in the Commission. We are the landlord on behalf of the people of the state of Western Australia. And we have some general handling principles here that we'd like to see observed, or we'd like to encourage groups, businesses, community groups devising planning surveys. And these are fairly self-explanatory, that investigation of flora and vegetation values needs to be in the context, from our point of view, in the overall vested lands. The whole concept of relationship between different species or micro-communities with what's going on within the vested area, within the reserve, and outside is very, very important for us to know. So surveys that touch on the immediate issues to be examined, but look at the broader context, are very much favoured by us. And the important point is that flora, species and communities may have heritage and cultural significance for traditional owners. I'm not going to quote a section of the Act here, but there is now statutory provision within this jurisdiction, and possibly elsewhere, for flora and fauna of particular cultural significance to Indigenous people to be part of the broader watching brief of the Commission and by extension the Department. As we've already seen, we include descriptions of flora, species and communities in the gazetted, the formally, legally prescribed management plans, and it goes without saying that flora, species and communities on reserve land are important core areas for the protection of values, the overall values of the park and the specific values related to species and other features within the park. In designing survey activities, I make the obvious point that we need, like all activities that take part on reserved conservation estate, to minimise the impacts on conservation values on traditional owners and public users. And can usually be sorted out, as many of you would know, by talking to the regional office of the department about access, terms of access. For example, if there's been obviously very wet weather, we're most reluctant to have people go in and do work because of the higher potential for disturbance. But as you would expect, having brought these reserve areas into the protected conservation estate, we seek to manage these through the department, acting on behalf of the Commission, and the general takeaway, of course, is that first point of call for any activity is to the local office. So it's a big estate that we look after, and I can't emphasise enough the competition for use of our natural environment that we see out there every day. The competition is intense, and it is assisted by, or it is exacerbated by the presence of technology. You know, four-wheel drives have been around for years. Our latest issue, the last year or two, has been drones. Yes. I was down at Woodman Point a couple of years ago and I watched a guy fishing for salmon, and he clipped his lure underneath his drone, and he piloted his drone out into the middle of the bay there while his partner was on the rod, and then when he said go, he unclipped the lure and it plonked out 250 metres out further than the average person can cast, and she busily began to retrieve this salmon lure. And I thought, gosh, if my late father could see that, he'd turn in his grave into the old school. If you can't throw it far enough, you can't catch it. So, but that's a humorous aside. We have had reports, just as we had with Anzac Day this year, up at the Central Park, of drone activity over parks and reserves. And what does that do to the amenity or quiet enjoyment of these areas? So these are the sorts of challenges that we have these days. To wind up, an exciting new concept is joint management. The Act was changed a short while back to recognise the role of traditional owners in the management of the conservation estate. Aboriginal peoples have a huge amount to contribute to our knowledge, and they want to be actively involved in the management of their traditional lands, and it provides an opportunity that we can use to protect cultural values, to increase knowledge of flora and fauna and landscape, and to work together to manage country for the protection of these values for successive generations. And this is fundamentally intergenerational, the business that we're in. So, just very quickly, just to give you some sense of the scale, last financial year in our reserves and parks, we had a total of 20.37 million visits with a almost 93% visitor satisfaction rating. Out in the conservation estate, there's a strong sense of community ownership. The department refers to the volunteers very affectionately as volleys. Almost 16,000 registered volunteers assist us. We've spoken about the values, we've spoken about well-being, and the Commission fundamentally sees itself as in a stewardship role on behalf of the people of this state, handling, managing, supported by the department, 39.5 million hectares of conservation estate. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Any questions?
Hello? To speak really.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yeah. We've had in the past things like the systems reviews to ensure the reserve system was adequate. Do you have an ongoing, rolling series of reviews to see how adequate the reserve system is against the CAR principles?
Good question. At the individual park or reserve level, there is a schedule of periodic review. And just very quickly, many of the old terrestrial reserves were conceived and promulgated in a system where modern key values and key performance indicators were not used. So we're trying to do all the modern terrestrial estate in that manner and retrospectively bring the old ones up to speed. The marine estate, work on that began more recently, and we have what we would call international standard practice key performance indicators. In the past, I think it would be fair to say that the review process was by reserve, by park. What we are looking at now is clustering. These are separate gazetted entities, and some of them are joined or some of them are separated by non-reserved areas. But it makes no sense to be reviewing a single park or reserve within a system or region without looking at other ones that are there. So prospectively, our practice through our periodic review schedule is probably coming a bit closer to what you are asking about, and that's because we've realised that an atomised system of periodic review just makes no sense.
We have time for one more question from Jess.
Hello? Yeah. The rather public stoush.
Do a Mick Jagger, hold it right up your lips.
The public stoush over the Helena and Aurora range recently, what's the status of the Mount Manning Nature Reserve expansion, I guess you could say, to incorporate those other ranges of banded ironstones to the south? Please.
You've got me. I can't answer that one straight off the cuff. I'd have to take a briefing on that. My apologies.
Yep, and maybe just one more. Dan Bunbury. I'm just wondering, obviously there's a lot of compatible use issues with a lot of land that you guys manage, or that DBCA manage.